This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Cherry Teresa. Cherry is the Vice President of Atheists for Liberty, an organization that is dedicated to exploring the relationship between atheism and political freedom. Cherry and I met at Freedom Fest in July, and I'm having her on today to talk about Atheists for Liberty, the meaning of atheism, the problems with religion, and how Christians and atheists can work together to promote freedom and liberty. Cherry, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Well, it was really great meeting you out in Vegas this year, and you were the one that put me in contact with Sundar Ear, who I had on my show a couple of weeks ago, and it was really great getting to talk to you and meeting some other people from the organization. Obviously, a lot of jokes about the Libertarian Christian Institute and Atheists for Liberty being together, but it was all good. Before we start talking about your organization and your philosophy, just tell us about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, so I'm the Vice President of Atheists for Liberty. I'm also on the board for author-philosopher Peter Boghossian's nonprofit, which is called National Progress Alliance. In my younger years, I was a semi-professional musician playing synthesizers, keyboard, piano, doing everything from metal, rock, alternative, and synth pop. And I did that for several years. And then when I got a little older, I went back to school and got my degrees in tech and data analytics. And so in addition to working with Atheists for Liberty, my day job is working as a data analyst here in the Los Angeles area, which is where I currently live.
Well, that sounds great. Well, talk to us a little bit about Atheists for Liberty. How did you get involved in the organization? How did you become vice president? What do you guys do? Just tell us all about that.
Sure. So we're a fairly new organization. We were founded in 2019 by our president, Thomas Sheedy, who's based out of the Long Island, New York area, and officially became a 501c3 nonprofit in 2020. We are not a political organization. I myself happen to be a small L libertarian and an independent, but we have people in our organization that are conservatives, libertarians, liberals, just people all over the political spectrum, and even apolitical people. And that's one of the reasons why we came about, because some of the other legacy organizations really started having mission creep and started implementing Marxism into their core values, which is not what many of us believe in. It's fine if you have those beliefs yourself, but we don't feel that that has anything to do with atheism and free thinking. So with Atheists for Liberty, we believe in advancing individual liberty. We safeguard secularism, which is the separation of church and state, which we believe both religious and non-religious people can live their best lives under secularism. We believe in preserving free thinking and enlightenment values. And most of all, we want to normalize atheism. Now, when we say normalize atheism, that doesn't mean that we as an organization are trying to go around converting people to atheism. But just to let people know that non-religious people are one of the largest growing demographics in the United States right now. We are your neighbors, we're your coworkers, your friends and family, and we just want to live together in peace with everybody else.
Yeah, and it's what's really incredible about this, and I've told this story to several people since being at Freedom Fest, is that since we have the same political values, we believe in free speech, we believe in the freedom of religion, we believe in free association, even though we have different philosophical and theological worldviews, it's very easy for us to get along because there's not a power dynamic where one of us is trying to suppress the others using political power. And I think that in and of itself is something that a lot of Americans have a hard time wrapping their mind around, that you can disagree with someone on fundamental issues, but still respect them and want to give them the space to practice their beliefs.
100%. And that's why we really enjoyed being at Freedom Fest, which is where we saw each other back in July, because there were a lot of religious people as well as non-religious people there. And we were all on the same page as just being wanting to get the government out of our lives when it's not necessary, and just being able to live free and live the way that, live with each other in harmony.
Yeah, and it was really great. Like I said, just having those dialogues, and I think they're really productive. I want to ask you a little bit about atheism and your
Mhm.
background, and just your perspective on religion in general. Before we do that, again, my audience knows I've had people on my show from all over the political and theological spectrum. The last 2 weeks of my show, I have featured Catholic guests. I've had Marxists, European socialists, people from all over. And I don't debate with people. I'm just interested in learning why they think the way that they do. And so I'm really excited just to talk to you so that you can explain atheism to my audience and how you think that worldview intersects with the ideas of libertarianism or political freedom. So I want to ask you, I guess, first of all, what does it mean for you to be an atheist?
Mhm.
And then how did you become an atheist?
So for me, being an atheist is very simple. I just personally don't believe in a God. I don't claim to know for a fact that God doesn't exist. I could very well be wrong. And if new evidence comes forward, we're constantly making advances in both science and technology. And so it would be really amazing, if there was some new discoveries that would be made, and I'd be totally willing to change my mind. But as it is now, I don't believe that God exists, and I live my life as though there is no God. Um, I, as a little bit of background, um, I was involved with organized atheism and skepticism prior to Atheists for Liberty. Um, I became officially sort of active in the late 2000s, and I would go to the conferences, I volunteered, I wrote articles and think pieces for different atheist and skeptic nonprofits. And it was a really great community for a while, and we felt like we actually finally had what we always noticed with religious communities that we always wish that the secular communities have, which is this strong sense of community, networking, belonging. It was really great for a period, and then it got infected with woke activists, unfortunately. We were okay with woke people being part of our movement, but their philosophy is they have intersectionalism, and they had to force it upon all the organizations that they were part of, even when it had nothing to do with the core values. And a lot of us fought back really hard against it for years, starting, I would say, in the early 2010s. And we were in the majority for a while. And then as time went on and events happened, such as 2016 and 2020, a lot of the people that I considered on the free thinking side moved over to the woke side. And so I kept in touch with a lot of the people in the community throughout the years. And so some of them went on to form Atheists for Liberty. And as soon as they told me about it, I was so excited, because it was just at this point where we needed to start a new organization, rather, because we were trying to fix the existing established organizations, and it just wasn't working anymore. A lot of times they also just didn't welcome us if we weren't Democrats or leftist, even though it has nothing to do with atheist, right? You could be any political ideology and be an atheist, but a lot of times they didn't welcome us in our organizations anymore. So that's a large part of why we started a new one. I got involved back in 2020, and I started out volunteering, and then me and my friend Lance, who's now our treasurer, we were doing the bookkeeping for AFL. I joined the finance committee and was on that for a few years, and then back in spring of this year, I became the vice president.
That's cool. That's really cool. And I totally understand that story. And I want to circle back to some of the political stuff here in a couple of minutes.
Mhm.
At what point in your life did you realize that that you were an atheist? And I read a little bit of your bio on your
Mhm.
website, and it seems like you were raised in a home where like a church was at least a part of what you did. Just at what point did you realize that that wasn't for you, or that wasn't something that you believed in?
I was pretty young. I was in middle school at the time. I didn't know I was an atheist. I don't think I knew the words atheist or agnostic, but I knew that I was a non believer. But I had kept it a secret for the first few years. It's actually not something that I was at the time. I was not proud of it. It's not. I wasn't trying to be like rebellious or different. At that point in my life, I was a good kid. I did good in school. I obeyed my parents. I stayed out of trouble. Um, and I was raised in a Christian household. For a little bit of background, I was baptized as a baby in Kentucky, actually, which is where I think you're
Okay.
from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then I was living with my mom and my late stepfather. Um, and we were living in Ohio at the time. And for several years, we went to a Korean United Methodist church. My mother is born and raised in South Korea. And the church was fine. I didn't have any issues with it. And I considered myself a Christian. But after several years of going to that church, my parents sat me down one day and said, we've actually been doing a lot of thinking lately, and we know we're Christians, but we don't actually know if we're United Methodist or if we're just going to that church because it's the Korean church in town.
Right.
And so we just want to look into some other options. We've done some research into some other churches in the area. And would it be okay if we tried out some other churches? If it doesn't work out, we can just always go back to the other church. And I said, great, let's do it. So we went to a few different churches in the area, and we all unanimously agreed that we actually loved this Baptist church that was in our community. And so we unanimously agreed that that was going to be our new church. And I actually got super involved in the church of my own choice. Nobody forced me to do it. Um, I am a classically trained pianist, and so I would play the piano on some of the Sunday services. I joined the handbell choir. I was part of the youth group and Bible studies. Um, I bought a Bible. Like, I had a grown up Bible, and then I had a student edition version of the Bible. And I was really just, for the first time in my life, just I was felt like I was the most religious I ever was. And most importantly, it was the first time in my life I think I really felt like I belonged and was accepted to a community. Um, and it was in that time period that I was actually doing a lot of studying of my own, and then also asking, the youth group leaders and the Sunday school teachers and the pastors some questions when things didn't make sense to me. Because prior to going to that church, my understanding of the Bible was everything that was read to me by my parents, by my pastor during Sunday services. But I was actually reading more of it on my own, and I started to find things that didn't sit right with me. There were some logical inconsistencies. And then two of the main things that really bothered me was the way that the Bible talked about slavery and how it talked about homosexuality. And I would question the religious leaders in our community about it. And the answer either just didn't make sense to me, or they would sometimes actually get angry with me. I was actually kicked out of Sunday school one Sunday,
Oh,
not
that's
being like a smart aleck or anything, but just trying to just make sense of certain things. And um, it just wasn't. Unfortunately, questioning wasn't always welcomed. Um, and so I started having doubts, but I kept it to myself. I didn't really tell anybody because I didn't want to not be a Christian anymore. And, it wasn't like being an atheism wasn't just like a quick decision I made overnight. It was this sort of long process. And I would sort of deny to myself that I was having doubts. But then there were two main events that really made me just admit to myself that I wasn't a believer anymore. The one big thing, so this was way back in 94, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being put into law for the first time. And, our church came out and made a stance on this. They didn't mention what they thought about gays in the military, but they were talking about, a lot of the churches in our neighborhood were saying that they were not going to allow gay people to be in their church. And our pastor said, we're actually a lot more open-minded. We'll allow a gay person to join our church if they're non-practicing, if they're in the closet. And that really actually upset me a lot, even though I was very young at the time. It just it was not what I expected my pastor to say. And I actually had a good relationship with him. And that was the first time I saw that side of him. And it really made me think, maybe the religious community is not as perfect as I thought it was. And then the second thing that happened was, Kurt Cobain took his life in 94 as well. And that had a huge impact on me. And I saw people in my community that I thought were really loving, nice people were talking very ugly about him and saying that, they hope that he's spending an eternity in hell for taking his own life. And, when I tell people about those two circumstances, they say, well, if you had gone to our church, we would not have said that. We are more open-minded and loving, and we accept LGBT people. But I would have still become an atheist anyway, even if I had gone to a different denomination. It's just that those two events are what made me sort of admit to myself, okay, I actually don't really believe in this anymore.
So how did the people in your life, like your mom, handle it when you told them that you were an atheist? Like, what was that? Was there any sort of social fallout from that? Like, did you have people pushing back on you? What happened as a result of that for you?
Yeah. So, I actually kept it a secret for the first couple years because I was actually pretty ashamed at the time. And then a couple years later, we ended up moving from Ohio to the Baltimore area. And the high school that I went to had a large Jewish community. And so I was the new kid. And so just trying to get to know me and just wanting to know who I am, they'd say, oh, well, you don't seem Jewish. Are you Christian? And that was the first time I said, actually, my parents are Christian, but I think I'm an atheist. And they'd say, oh, that's cool. And nobody cared. It was just like, they just wanted to get to know me kind of thing. And that's when I first was like, maybe it isn't this shameful thing. I started telling my parents, I didn't use the atheist word because I think that would have scared them, but I did explain that I had some doubts. My mother was pretty disappointed in it, but she has come to accept it. My other side of the family, my dad and my stepmother, we have a very good relationship now, but there was a period where we weren't really talking. I guess we were sort of no contact with each other, because the religious denomination that they were part of, they were also Christian, but they were one of those, I think, I don't know if you pronounce it, new millenniarism is millennialism or something. It's where they think that that the world's going to end, and that they are going to have a special place in heaven and those kind of things. And it's one of those things where usually when people leave the church, they kind of don't talk to you anymore. But we have a really great relationship now. I think they realize now that, my whole thing is not coming from a place of trying to be disobedient. It's just something that I put a lot of thought into. And I also think that they see the way my life has turned out. I'm not living this debaucherous life, right? And so
Yes.
I think just kind of living your own life. I think, they aren't atheists. I think they wish that I was Christian, but they love and respect me. And I love and respect them too. So it's turned out good in the long run.
Well, that's I'm very glad to hear that. That's awesome. Well, I want to dive into some of the philosophy real quick. What are some of your specific problems with like kind of religion in general? Mm-hmm. And then with reference to Christianity, you talked about how you were in this church and you were reading the Bible and you saw that there were some tensions and contradictions there. So I want to talk to you again, first of all, just about like religion in general. How do you perceive that? And then what about Christianity in particular do you find challenging or inconsistent?
So with religion in general, there tends to end up being a lot of dogma and a lot of groupthink. And I'm against that, whether it's in religion, whether it's, social justice activist groups or, their secular cults. I think that ends up being very dangerous. But even when it doesn't happen so much, with religion in general, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hindu, New Age beliefs, um, there's a lot of supernatural beliefs um, that I don't believe in, and in particular with Christianity, Jesus being born of a virgin, Jesus resurrecting after 3 days, the belief in literal miracles that defy science and physics. And just that was a lot of the questions that I had, was just trying to explain things like that. And, ultimately, I do understand a lot of religious people say, well, it doesn't always make sense, but you have to have faith. And for me, I don't have that faith.
Yeah, and I do think that that is kind of like a cop out answer for a lot of religious people, and it's kind of like what you were saying before about how you found it difficult to ask questions at your church. That was one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that when I was growing up as a Christian, I found really challenging too, because when I was in high school, I was reading my New Testament, and I had a lot of questions about issues in the Bible. And when I would ask some of these adults, it was like they were almost offended by the fact you even had the question. And I think that a culture like that makes it very difficult for people to even have an honest conversation about some of these complexities.
Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting to hear, because for me, when I was asking these questions, I was thinking about it the same way as if I was in school, right? If I got a
Right.
math question wrong and it didn't make sense to me, the teacher would talk to me after class, show me how to do the equation, and I'd go, "Oh, okay, I know what I did wrong, and now it makes sense." And I was expecting the religious leaders to do something like that, and a lot of times they just didn't even like the fact that I had the questions. And I just curious, what denomination are you?
Oh man, that's a good question. So I was born and baptized Catholic, and then I grew up in a Lutheran church. I wound up going to like a Restoration Movement college, which is like Church of Christ. And then I was actually in ministry for 8 years. I worked at a Lutheran church. I worked at a Methodist church, and now my wife and I go to a Nazarene church. So that's why I kind of like the label Protestant, because it's just a
Hmm.
very general label that describes my theology. I don't really hang my hat on one particular denomination, but a part of the reason for that is I've been involved in so many different denominations, and I've met Christians that I feel like are very genuine and very faithful in every tradition. And then I meet a lot of Christians that are just complete hypocrites and very insincere in what they believe in every tradition. And I think theologically, not one tradition has a monopoly on the truth. Like I think that there are both strengths and problems theologically with every single Christian tradition. So like for me and my wife, our qualification for finding a church was that we want a church that tries to reckon with some of these challenges in the Bible and that serves their community. And it just so happened that the best church that does that in our area is a Nazarene church. And that's kind of where we landed.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience because we moved around a little bit too, and sometimes the different denominations can vary just depending on what neighborhood or what part of the country you're in.
Yeah, it's completely true. And that is one of the reasons though. Like the Nazarene Church is a Wesleyan church. So it's very similar to the United Methodist Church. And one of the things that I like about Wesleyanism is that it is more open-minded than some other American Protestant denominations. Like I feel like I can have honest conversations at my church about some of these issues. And again, like with my background in biblical studies, I have a different perspective on the Bible and the way that it works historically than a lot of people in my church, which has led me to some theological conclusions that very conservative Christians would see as maybe even not just being like heterodox, but maybe even a little heretical too. But I feel like I have space in my church to at
Hmm.
least ask and address these questions because people are more open minded. Whereas when I was going to a Lutheran church, and I love that church. I grew up in that church, a lot of amazing people there, but the leadership was always very skeptical about challenging any of the tenets of Lutheran orthodoxy, and it made it very oppressive. And again, there were a lot of kids that grew up in youth group when I was there that wound up doing exactly what you did. They tried to ask genuine questions. They did not get good answers. And when they grew up, they rejected the faith. And I can totally understand why people would do that if they don't feel like they have these burning questions and that there are good answers to them. And even worse, that church leaders don't want to answer those questions.
Yeah, yeah, and I think if more churches were like that, it would not only be better for the people of that religion, and it would probably keep more people in the religion, but I would feel like it would be more able to live with different communities, because it sounds like it's much more open minded and less dogmatic.
Yeah, and I think again, it's one thing to say like, hey, I'm a Presbyterian or I'm a Lutheran or whatever, and I really believe in that theology and I value that theology. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to say I know that I'm right about all of these issues, and everyone else that disagrees with me even a little bit is completely wrong and probably not a real Christian. I don't think that that's helpful. And again, like when I went to school and studied the Bible historically, there are a lot of passages in the New Testament, a lot of very important passages that, depending on the historical source material you're reading against, could go in several different directions. And so, man, the thought that I like as an individual would have the answer to all of these really complex questions, it just sounds like so incredibly arrogant, you know?
Yeah.
And that burns that kind of gets me fired up when I see Christians that are out there with that level of certitude. It seems from my perspective that they haven't really thought about what they believe.
Yeah. Well, that's good that you see that, and that you're willing to push back and call that out when necessary.
Yeah, I really feel like, again, it's kind of like what you were saying. We need to be intellectually honest, and this is one of the reasons why I am such a hardcore libertarian. I feel like there are a lot of issues that I just don't know, and so I would rather give people the space to explore them and study them and think about them, and then maybe we can have a conversation about it that actually pushes our knowledge as a civilization forward, instead of just building walls that block us off from each other and refusing to address like questions that people have about our traditions. I just think that that's a much better way of dealing with it. And especially like for me, I do believe in God, but I know that like if you believe that God exists, there's nothing that's bigger than that question, right? And so like, and how could I, as a finite human being, ever possibly like understand God in a holistic sense? Like the idea that I could comprehend that is just it's ridiculous to me, you know?
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good attitude, is to just be humble and just say you don't know, and you don't know everything, and sometimes you just have to experience things with life, like when you're a kid you don't know everything, but if you're given a book that claims to have all the answers, um you don't have the chance to really just decide on your own and just sort of make those mistakes and organically learn and build those values on your own.
Yeah, and it's really important. It's really important, I think, that Christians become critical thinkers. But there, it's like you were saying. At least in the American church, there's just not a lot of leaders that seem to really value that. I did want to ask you though, I know that there are atheists that have various opinions on this. Do you find any redeeming value in religious belief? Like, do you believe that? Because I know that there are some atheists that are very extreme and that say that like all religious belief is harmful. But then there are some that are like, well, maybe religion does serve at least a sociological function, that there are positives to certain kinds of religious beliefs. Where do you land on that? Do you see any redeeming value in religious belief?
Well, there's the community, which I think is really great. And in my high school, I was really particularly impressed with the Jewish community, between the synagogues and the Jewish community centers that they had. It was really a beautiful thing. And, you don't necessarily need God to have those communities, but I do think the religious tend to do it better than the secular have. And we need to do better with that. As far as the actual beliefs, with Christianity in particular, I do find some really good values in the Bible. And I think there's certain values in the Bible that even like people in the West and even sometimes Christians take for granted because it's all we've ever heard growing up. Um, so, for a little bit of background, I mentioned my mother was born and raised in South Korea. She grew up there during the Korean War. The country was very different than it is now. They didn't have a lot of rights and democracy. They weren't the tiger economy that they are now. And my mother didn't have a lot, access to books and education, a TV. She didn't have electricity in the house or anything like that. And these missionaries came to her neighborhood, and so she got really involved with the missionaries, and not just with my mother, but a lot of Koreans in general. They were hearing certain concepts for the first time that actually really changed their lives. The two main concepts being that um, basically equality and free will. So with the Bible's interpretation of equality is that we are all God's children. God loves us all, and we are all equal in the eyes of the Lord. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, of course, but we all deserve equality. Um, and then the concept of free will, which I know not all atheists believe in, but if you live as though it does exist, it can really change your life. Historically in Korea, there was a belief that the elite and the royals, um, there was a lot of inequality. And of course, the elite had a much better life. It was very unfair. Um, and a lot of Koreans used to believe that, well, those people come from a different bloodline. Those people sort of kind of low key deserve a better life than we do, than the lower class. Um, Not everybody believed that, but it was, due to values like Confucianism, that was a very common belief. And then hearing those values from the Bible for the first time really actually change people's entire perspective of thinking, because they go, well, wait a minute. God loves us all and we are all equal. So those elites are not better than me. They just happen to be born to a rich family, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then when you add that with the concept of free will, it gets people thinking, you know what? Just because I was born in the lower class doesn't mean that my entire fate is set. This is not the life that I want for myself. It's not the life that I want for my future children. And since I have free will, I need to do something about this to change my life. Now, unfortunately, people are subjected to the circumstances in which they live. So if you live in a country that doesn't have capitalism and free markets and in
Yeah.
a constitutional republic, you're very limited in what you can do. And so many of the citizens fought for those values, and the country's a lot better now. And then other people, such as my mother, that is some of the main reasons I believe that she wanted to move to the United States. That, coupled with her personal experiences and hardships that she went through, she wanted to live somewhere where there was capitalism, even though we technically have a mixed economy, but it was certainly more capitalistic than what she had at the time. She wanted someplace with a constitutional republic and Enlightenment values. And had it not been for her talking to the missionaries, her life probably would have been radically different. Now, when I bring that story up to a lot of atheists, they'll say, well, those two concepts are not unique to Christianity. You don't have to believe in God to believe in equality. And a lot of people outside of religion believe in free will. And that's true. And, they'll cite certain academics and certain philosophers. And that's wonderful. But the reality is there were no philosophers going over to to South Korea during the Korean War. There were no, and I think that goes again with the community and the networking and that support system that you can start a missionary and that you can go over there. She did have some negative experiences as well, but I think overall it really changed her life for the better. And I might have not have been born, or at the very least, I wouldn't be living in the United States right now had it not been for her learning those values.
Yeah, no, I really resonate with that story. The next question that I want to ask you about that too is about the historical figure of Jesus. Do
Mm-hmm.
you think that Jesus as a figure in history is worth admiring, or do we simply not know enough about him? What are your thoughts on him as a man in history?
Yeah, so I know there's a lot of debates within the non-religious community as to whether Jesus actually existed. Some people think that a historical Jesus existed, but he just wasn't the Son of God. Some people think it's made up. Other people think he's a combination of different historical figures. I don't have a strong opinion of it either way, because ultimately for me, I don't believe that he's the Messiah. However, if I have thought a lot about if a historic Jesus exists, what do you think of him? And I have mixed opinions about it. There's values that he had that I think are pretty universal, which is loving your neighbors, even loving sinners, helping the sick and the needy and the downtrodden, and not judging people, even sex workers or people in different classes of people. And he promoted charity and voluntarism, which libertarians can
Yeah.
get down with. um and I think all of that are great values. And I find that the Christians that have that as their core values tend to be just really great, wholesome people. However, there's some other things that kind of come into question. If he wasn't actually the Son of God and he was just a regular guy, then I have a different perspective on his disciples, his 12 disciples, because a lot of them really just dropped everything they were doing and gave up their lives to work with Jesus. Which, if Jesus is the Son of God, that's a very noble thing to do, and it totally makes sense. But if he's just some guy, and he knows he's just some guy, right? And he's allowing these people to leave their children and their wives, especially at a time when women need a man, women need,
Right. Yeah.
another person to, even today,
Yes.
it's good to have two parents, but especially back in those days, a woman is like, without a man, it's just very hard to survive and to raise children. And so, if he knew that they were doing that and was okay with that, I don't think it makes him an evil person. I just think it would just make him human, right? Which is, we're all complicated. We're all
Right.
imperfect. And so I just look at certain things in a different light, when you look at it from a historical rather than a religious aspect.
No, I think that's a very fair thought. The next question I want to ask you about too is one that Christians will often levy at atheists. I think a little bit hypocritically, and I'm gonna give you the question and then kind of set up where I come down on it and have you explain it. But it's the question of what grounds your moral and political worldview. So there are a lot of Christians, and I agree with the statement on its face that would say that without a God, there is no sort of ultimate objective grounding for morality and ethics. Okay, so I would agree with that statement technically, but what a lot of Christians mean by that is their interpretation of the Bible or their understanding of God is actually the grounding for morality and ethics, and not pursuing after God himself. So there are a lot of Christians that they say, okay, God has to be the ultimate source of our ethics, but in reality, it's just their own subjective preferences, and they use God as kind of an excuse to force their subjective preferences on other people. And so I think that in some ways, like that way of making the argument is not very helpful. And there are a lot of Christians that, in my opinion, aren't actually concerned about what's objectively morally right and wrong. They're more concerned about defending their own perspective against those that have a different perspective than them. But I want to ask the question to you as well. So as an atheist, without there being a God, what is the grounding for your moral and political worldview? And why would you value freedom as like a moral good from that perspective?
Yeah, so I use a combination of, history, my personal experience, humanist values, enlightenment values. Also, I think the non-aggression principle, although it doesn't cover every aspect of life, I think that for me, that's been a really good guide, when something doesn't seem obvious to me on both, I think, a moral perspective and in most cases a legal perspective. I think about, like, what does the non-aggression principle say, and I think that helps with a lot of gray areas. And I think, like, as libertarians, I think that's something that, it would be a good thing to promote, because I think that can appeal to a lot of people, even people that don't identify as libertarians. You do risk, getting things wrong and not getting things right the first time. Um, but I think what's good about it is there's no dogma that, or no community that's going to come down on you if you change your mind based on, okay, this didn't actually work out for me, or I knew
Right.
somebody that went through this, and okay, actually this is not a good value, and you change with time. And so there's no sort of punishment for that. So I think that's good. And I think what you mentioned before is, like, a lot of people that they may truly believe in their hearts that they may use a holy book for their morals, but a lot of times they're actually using they're using their rational mind, because if something seems outdated, they may try to interpret it in a different way, or they may say, well, this was meant as an allegory, but this was meant literal. And it's like, but you're picking and choosing what you think is literal and what's an allegory, or what has a separate, or was just of its time or something like that. So you're trying to justify it. So really, a lot of people do actually use their own rational mind to decipher it.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say that the majority of Christians that I meet, even really good, faithful Christians that I think are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, will still do exactly what you said. And again, I think a lot of that is just the fact that we are very, like, epistemologically, we're just limited creatures. The Bible was written 2,000 years ago in a cultural context that's very different from our own. I think historically speaking, we have to be very careful about how we make applications from a 2,000-year-old document to the modern world, because it was being written in a context that is just dramatically different than our own. And so a lot of the cultural assumptions of the original audience of the works that are in the New Testament are fundamentally different than our own. We can't just assume that because they make a statement that sounds like it resonates with something in our culture, that was actually the intention that the original author was trying to communicate. But I completely agree. I think that a lot of people have they have a very subjective set of ethics and morality, and they use the Bible as a means of reinforcing beliefs that they already have, instead of allowing those beliefs to be challenged by the Bible, which is what, like, especially if you're a Protestant Christian, that's really what it's supposed to be there for. Like, you should be in dialogue with it to see if your social values that you kind of just inherited from your culture are actually true. And I think, to your point, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of Christians that aren't even aware that that's a problem to begin with, and then that would have a difficult time unpacking that if they even understood that was what was happening.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, I mean, it's a good thing that people are using their rational mind, whether they realize it or not, because, then the alternative is you have some groups such as, Westboro Baptist Church, where they believe almost everything is literal, and that's not a good thing either. But it's just, just being able to recognize that you're doing that, and just to understand that you aren't necessarily 100% basing it on a holy book.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that understanding of it. I do want to switch gears and talk to you about the politics of atheism a little bit, because we got about 20 minutes left. And one of the things that a lot of Christians in particular, and I guess this goes back to Richard Dawkins published his book The God Delusion in, I think, 2007. We all read it and everything like that. And just to be completely honest, it was listening to a lot of the lectures that Richard Dawkins gave about evolution in particular that convinced me that, as a scientific theory for the origins of the material universe, that seems very valid. And I think that Richard Dawkins is very passionate about that. Obviously, I disagree with his take on Christianity.
Sure.
That's neither here nor there. But I think what a lot of conservative American Christians got from that book was that Richard Dawkins was a leftist. And I think that in some quarters of the American church, they're almost more mad at people like Richard Dawkins that they would vote for Democrats if they were Americans than in their critique of religion. But it does bring up a good point. There are people like, Michael Shermer, and there's some other mainstream atheists, very open atheists, that are, like libertarian or conservative leaning, but it does seem like a lot of them are either progressive or on the left in some way. Why do you think that there are so many atheists that gravitate towards the left half of the political spectrum?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of reasons, but I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the history of politics. When we're talking about the United States in particular, I think there's two main things that happened, which was the Cold War and the Red Scare. I don't like that term, Red Scare, but there was that period.
Right.
And then there was the rise of the religious right beginning in the 70s and the 80s. So, going back to the Cold War era, you had McCarthyism, which I was against, even though I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a communist, but I'm against what they were doing and blacklisting people, and basically old school cancel culture, right? And they started adding, One Nation Under God and In God We Trust, on our currency and things like that. Those things aren't huge things that bother me, but I understand why people don't like it, because they don't believe that it honors the First Amendment and the separation of church and state. So I do understand why that bothers people. And then moving on to the rise of the religious right as a political force, with sort of like the culture wars and cancel culture and outrage culture. I think both the left and the right have always been guilty of it. I think, the current period we're living in, like the 2010s through the current period, it's more dominated by the left, but previously, like in the 80s to the 2000s, it was dominated more so by the right. It was the right that would protest if a sitcom had two women kissing on each other next week, rather than just tuning out that week and just saying, I'm not going to watch that. A lot of times people would actually threaten the local stations, go there and protest, which I believe in your right to protest, but the fact they wanted to cancel it, and sometimes, and it usually happened to be in more conservative cities, they would just preempt it with other programming. I remember when I was a kid, Marilyn Manson was really popular, and I understand he's not everybody's cup of tea, but it was the religious right that were trying to get the band actually banned from performing in their city rather than just simply not attend. Like, nobody's forcing you to go to the concert or buy your ticket, right? And it was also the religious right, especially in the 2000s decade, that were um, doing, they were trying to get evolution. Even prior to the 2000s, but they were trying to get evolution banned from being taught in public schools, being creationism being taught as fact. It's very similar to what the woke left is doing with putting their Marxist ideology in public
Yeah.
schools. They were doing the similar thing decades ago. The left used to be more associated with free speech, but they're not anymore. They used to be more tolerant of diversity of thought. And it used to be that, that the conservative movement was the one that was pushing against, same-sex marriage and things like that. And so I think, just historically speaking, I think for a lot of people, it just seemed like a no-brainer to be on the left. I do see a lot of people, though, in the past 10, 15 years, people who consider themselves lifelong Democrats actually, changing their minds or just becoming centrists or independents, libertarians, conservatives, because they're starting, a lot of times they didn't even really question their political beliefs. They just thought it was a no-brainer. And then now that they're starting to see some of the flaws of those beliefs, they're starting to change their minds.
Yeah, and I think that actually says a lot about the intellectual consistency of people like that. And I mean, have to give him full credit. When Richard Dawkins was attacked about asking questions on the trans issue a couple of years ago, he more or less just said, like, these are questions that I think need to be asked. And it's funny with people like him and J.K. Rowling, they've definitely, just because I think the left has gotten so extreme, you think about them in 2005 or 2006 terms, they would have been on the far left in that era. But now they're centrist, and in a lot of ways, people like me have a lot in common with people like them, because we believe in free speech and we believe in the right for people to associate with each other. And so it is interesting how I think the leftward shift towards more and more political extremes have actually taken people like that were already kind of intellectually dissident and just allowed them to be more open about that politically. Do you think that there is, within like the atheist movement, space for a lot of atheists to be convinced in the ideas of liberty?
I think there is, but it just depends on, who you're talking to, and there's different movements and groups and organizations. And so there are some groups that are that are actually straight up socialist or Marxist. And with that, they tend to be very dogmatic. And so with those groups of people, it isn't. If you look at, for example, American Atheists, they've been around since, I believe, the 1960s, and for decades they did got a lot of good work. But in recent years, I never was officially involved with American Atheists, but I'll sometimes look at the lectures that they have online and the yearly conference that they have, and back in the day they were fighting for the same values that Atheists for Liberty are fighting for, freedom of speech and separation of church and state and freedom of religion. And now their conferences, they're talking about how white atheists are racist, and we all have cisgender privilege. And I mean, there's some truth to some of the stuff that they're saying, but what does that have to do with atheism? And
Right.
I left religion because, like, I didn't like the other church that I went to on the other side of my family. Like, there was these sort of, like, it felt like these struggle sessions where you were made to feel bad about yourself for being a sinner, and then, like, the original sin. And I was like, this reminds me of this church that I didn't like. Like, why is this happening with atheism? This is just this ridiculous. And, like, some of these groups, they have stuff that almost resembles like these Maoist struggle sessions, which it's just so it really just depends. I mean, but if you take your average atheist, your average atheist, it's just a normal person, isn't an activist, isn't really involved in any of this stuff. A lot of times they just kind of keep it to themselves. They don't really talk
Yeah.
about it unless they're asked about it. Those, your average atheist, I'd say, yeah, you can have those conversations. They are going to be pretty open-minded, but it just really depends.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The last question I want to ask you about politics in particular has to do with why so many politicians appeal to religious belief. Now, for me, like I really do believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and it wasn't long after I became a Christian as a teenager that I kind of came, and I didn't know what libertarianism was back then, so I didn't have the language to identify the political consequences of my belief. But I always just assumed that like if you believe that Jesus is a king, then you should probably just follow him and not really trust politicians. Like I kind of
Hmm.
intuitively got that when I was a teenager. And even like before I was political in any way, before I had any sort of, real political principles, it always bothered me that there were politicians that appealed to Christianity because I just didn't think that that was the right space for that kind of rhetoric. Do you think that politicians do it simply to buy votes? Because I look at a lot of these politicians like, Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever. They say they're Christian nationalists. And I don't like in any meaningful way, I don't see how their values reflect my Christian beliefs. And so it seems like in a lot of ways they're just doing it because they know that there's a demographic of Americans that will vote for somebody that says that they're Christians. Maybe I'm being cynical. I mean, do you think that these politicians are sincere, or do you think that they just do it to buy votes, or why do so many politicians feel the need to appeal to religious belief?
Yeah, I agree with you. And when I was a Christian, it bothered me as well because even though I truly believed at that time, but I also believed in the Constitution. I was like, wait a minute, what about separation of church and state? Like, not everybody's a Christian, and not everybody's the same denomination of Christian, right? So how do we even choose like which religion or which denomination, which interpretation? Um, and I think it's a combination of things. I do think there's probably a minority of politicians that is their personal belief, that they are both religious and they also believe in a theocracy, which I think everybody should oppose, religious or
Yes.
non-religious, not just Christianity. I mean, like you look at these Muslim theocracies, it doesn't matter what the religion, it
Yeah.
just always ends badly.
Always.
Um, and it's very dangerous. I think some of them truly believe in it, but I think a lot of it has to do with the Christian right became a force to be reckoned with starting in the 70s and the 80s. Prior to that, of course, Christians always exist as both Democrats and conservatives, but it wasn't like this core principle of their politics like it later became, and they weren't this political machine that they later became. And then they started to push for things that were not just universal values that everybody can believe in, but they were trying to actually get rid of secularism. They were trying to implement theocracy. They were get doing abstinence only education in school and in public schools, and getting out the actual sex education. Um, and things like that. And just as a side note, I know for a fact that a lot of the woke activists actually modeled what they did after the Christian activists, because I remember before it got big, a lot of the people who became involved with those movements said, we need to do what the Christian right's doing because they're organized, they've got this strong community, they've got this network of people, and that's how they keep beating us, even though we believe we're right and they're wrong. So we need to, and unfortunately they did it, but they did it in all the wrong ways, and they started implementing all these crazy ideas. But I think because some of the politicians maybe in their heart don't want to go along with it, but they know it's just this terrible fight. They know a certain, depending on what parts of the country they're in as well, it's just this, they're never going to get elected if they don't fight against that. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's important for even religious people to fight back against it, because it shows it's not an atheist thing or a Jewish thing, right? It's just a liberty and a freedom value.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, that brings me to the last question that I want to ask you today. I really enjoyed meeting you guys at Freedom Fest, you and Thomas and everyone else at the booth. And it's been awesome talking with you today. And I think anyone listening would realize that we have like a lot more common ground than the average person would think that a Christian and atheist could have with each other. How can we have more conversations like this? Like, what's the best way to promote dialogue between Christians and atheists that both believe in freedom and liberty? And how can we work together to promote this vision?
Yeah, I think most people, we're more alike than we are different. Of course, there's always extremists on both sides,
Right. Yeah.
and closed-minded people, and we have closed-minded atheists. But most people, you just have a conversation with them. You find the core, the core beliefs that you have in common. We both believe in freedom of speech and liberty and freedom. And even just little things like you like the same music, you like the same bands, just connecting to people on a human value, just to break down those walls, break down those stereotypes, and that gets the dialogue going. I think in particular with the Libertarian Christian Institute and AFL, some of the things that we at least I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we have these things in common. Of course, the First Amendment issues that I mentioned before, I think we're pretty much on the same page.
Yeah.
But I think there's some more recent issues that have sort of come back up in the culture wars that I think it would be great if we could work together, or at the very least be a united front. One of the things is it seems like Christian nationalism is trying to make a comeback. And is it wrong for me to assume that like you guys are against that?
Oh, 100%. And in fact,
Yeah.
we've actually, I debated publicly Stephen Wolfe, one of America's leading Christian nationalists. His version of Christian nationalism is a lot more intelligent than the other ones, but I would say that especially starting in 2023, probably 30% of the articles that we have published have been against Christian nationalism. And I know I've released like 8 episodes on my show about that as well. So we are 100% against Christian nationalism.
And I think that's great. And I think it's actually very powerful when other Christians speak out against it, because it shows it's not about the Christianity per se. What, if it was Islam nationalism or any other type of Hindu nationalism, I would be against it. It's just the fact that it is not the best way to run a country. And, which religion do you choose? Which interpretation do you choose? Right. And so I think that's really powerful. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, what do you guys feel about, I think it was the state of Louisiana that made it a law. I think it's going to be challenged, but it's supposed to be like starting in 2025 in public schools and in public universities, that it's going to be a requirement for the 10 Commandments to be displayed. And some other states are actually trying to enact that as well. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I mean, we're against it, and you got to understand, like most of the people at LCI are anarchists, so we're pretty against the public school system in general.
Okay.
and we definitely don't want the public school system to be misrepresenting our theological beliefs, which by definition they always do whenever they attempt to pass legislation like this.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Like, the school does not always have the best interpretation. So even if you're totally on board with it, you actually shouldn't be on board, because it's probably, you might like it in theory, but in practice, it's not going to be great. So I think those two very topical issues, it would be great. And if you guys agree, like, I'd love to have a conversation offline about how we could work together on those things, or at the very least, just be a united front. I think it would be really powerful.
Yeah, no, that sounds incredible. Well, the last thing that I want to ask you before we go is, there are the people that listen to this show. The majority of my audience, they're very interested in these ideas, and they want to read and they want to listen because they're interested in learning more about these ideas that we discuss. What resources would you recommend for people who want to learn more about atheism, that really want to understand it? Because I grew up in the era of the new atheist, so it was Christopher Hitchens, and I found Christopher Hitchens to be a very interesting person, and Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, who's kind of gone off the deep end in the last couple of years, unfortunately. But I used to think he was very intelligent. But what resources would you recommend today for people who are interested in learning more about atheism?
So, Atheists for Liberty, we have podcasts and live streams on our YouTube channel where we talk to different intellectual figures and academics and activists. We have our YouTube channel. It's at Atheist for Liberty. We're also on X, formerly Twitter. We have our weekly X Spaces. We usually do them on Thursday. And those are similar conversations, but they're audio only. So we have those live streams, and you could check those out at Atheist Liberty. As far as books, I really like Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, and I agree with you. He does a really good job, not just in that book, but his other books of explaining evolution. It made me understand it in a way I didn't before. It made me have a much deeper understanding. I think that's a great book. God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. A Manual for Creating Atheists by Peter Boghossian. I I also liked, I didn't agree with everything in this book, but I really liked The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris back before he got sort of tedious.
Right.
And it's just, it answers a lot of the questions of sort of how do you get your morals without a holy book? Like I said, I don't agree with everything, but it's just interesting to see his sort of thought process in that, and that sort of changed my mind. So I think those are good books to check out.
Well, Cherry Teresa, it's been great talking with you today. Before I let you go, where can people find you and follow you?
So I have a website. It's cherryteresa.com. It's CherryTeresa, and it's got all the links to my socials. I'm on X, Facebook, SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify. So some TikTok videos. So you can check out all the links at cherryteresa.com.
Well, Cherry, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.